This is Willpower.
Now we're sitting here in Austin, Texas. My beautiful friend, Will Rezin. And I'm about to have a very important conversation. I think that's mostly because you were so gracious to sit down with me, but also to have this important conversation around the space that I continue to work in and that you have such a level of expertise in, the space around navigating trauma and somatics. And the practitioners, the clinicians, the coaches, the clients, the people that come to my mentorship, there is a general question that floats in the air where, because there's this low-level fear of doing something wrong with another human being that we may be working pretty closely with, whether that be body work or any of these other modalities where we are unpacking parts of ourselves under the guidance of a coach, that there is this conversation that's bubbled up, for lack of a better word, in the last 5 years, much more so to the front burner, around big T, little t trauma. How do we become more somatically aware? The coaches that I work with, the nurses, doctors even, how am I trauma informed? Am I trauma aware? Like, what am I supposed to be doing with these words? Can I talk about the specifics? And so many different types of people showing up, wondering how to catalyze all the things in their life from childhood onward into the humans that they are now. And then additionally, all of us, none of us are perfect. So we all bring our own party mix to the party. Mm-hmm. And this is why I wanted to spend some time with you sharing with this team of coaches and the audience that I get to speak to about your work, because it's so deep and pivotal. And I said this to you downstairs and just before, that there's really this innate understanding that you have of what another person needs, or what's going to put them at ease, or what's going to settle them so they can be just as present, and that's the gift. Mm-hmm. So I wanted you to share a bit about, some exposition about how you got to be doing this work so profoundly.
Mm. I love this question, and every time I'm in an interview, I look for a new way to answer it. My life, the way I've lived my life is how I've become who I am, I'm sure. But infinite curiosity as a child, exploring the world, exploring people, asking questions, a love for play, and creativity, and then so many years of pain. And the learning I had to go through about how to be with my own pain, suffering, trauma. And that coupled with this curiosity about human beings, about history, about culture, about myths. And so if I speak a little less abstractly, living through hardship as a teenager into my early 20s, led me towards experimenting with psychedelics pretty intensely, LSD specifically, which began as a turning away from the pain. I just want to feel something that's good. And not really knowing how, not being really fully equipped at the time in my life to process the trauma, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the emotional abuse that I lived through as a teenager. But as you know, with psychedelics, we may think we're able to run away, but with LSD specifically, we're not getting away from ourselves. And so it began with this wonderful feeling of, oh my gosh, I can feel good again. Oh, look at all the colors and all the fun and the laughter. And not long after that, a few nights on my own meant that I wasn't in the play anymore. I was with myself and what was deeper and what was inside. And
and would you say slightly uprooted by the LSD experience?
Yeah, definitely. brought forward, unavoidable. I couldn't turn away from it. I couldn't stop my thoughts from thinking themselves. I couldn't not confront the pain and the difficulty and the memories of things that would come up and surface, and the making sense of life, even while I was still in this sort of tumultuous period of my life at that point. I'm talking late teens. And in that time period, I began exploring different cultural myths. And so I had this tether to some sort of something else, the spirituality, the unseen world, stories about people finding teachers or gurus, or they might not have been gurus in the particular myths that I was reading, but going on a long journey. And that stirred something deep in my soul about like being on this journey and finding some sort of teacher. At the time in my life, I didn't find a teacher, but I kept reading and reading and reading as much as I could find. And this is the beginning of the internet, being able to really search and find archives of documents and things like that. And I went searching. I had a torrent program or something like that. I was looking for PDFs on it. And I scoured everywhere to find these PDFs of these ancient texts, and I began reading them. And that, in a funny way, brought me back full circle to self-examination and self-awareness. And really obscure ceremonial or religious practices involve being aware of ourselves. And specifically even with ceremonial magic, and we're going to kind of take a really esoteric turn here for a moment. But I got fascinated with this stuff. And what I realized, the deeper I got into it, was that it's a process of self-awakening that's required. And there's a purification that's required to be able to practice in those secret societies, so to speak. And so I began my own process of self-exploration. I discovered Carl Jung's work at, was it like 17 or 18? And I remember reading one of his books. I couldn't tell you which one it is, but I still have it. And I started doing dream work. And I had a book on astral projection, and so I started doing lucid dream work. And then I got to a point where I was taking objects with me into my dreams and carrying them with me the whole dream, or visiting people. And this started to fuel this curiosity and this excitement that there's more than what I had known in the world. And my interest in this, and I've had this investigative spirit most of my life. So I'll learn a little bit of something about a topic. I'll read a book. The book will reference 2 or 3 authors. I'll go and I'll read something by one of those 2 or 3 authors, or maybe all 3 of them. And they'll reference an author or a teacher, and I'll go read about that author or that teacher. And so I did this for years with spirituality and with mysticism, and then that sort of turned into psychology, an interest in psychology. And meanwhile, I'm still trying to figure myself out, still trying to figure out how to deal with my own pain. And I say deal with, but what I mean is be with it, like really be able to tolerate feeling it.
Yeah, and I imagine reading Carl Jung and looking into other aspects is going to raise some questions for yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I began to investigate my thinking. I wasn't so much connected to my body, but I was definitely connected to paying attention to my thought patterns and analyzing some of the components of my psyche. I did a lot of dream work where I journal my dreams for months and practice dreaming so I would remember my dreams every day. I would sit down and do different sorts of journal writing to stimulate different awarenesses of myself. And I hit this point where I was finished with high school, and I didn't graduate high school. I went and got my GED. I was just bored and also dealing with the symptoms of trauma. And I was going to be a rock star. And that was my plan. coming out of school. Yeah, that was my plan. No, I don't need college. And I figured one day I'll go back to college.
When I'm done with my world tour.
That's right. When I'm done playing in the world, I'll settle down and I'll get a corporate job of some kind because I'm smart enough. I can definitely do that. That was the thought process.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I was just exploring consciousness, life, play. And in the early 2000s, I had a back injury and I was taking some prescription medicine, and I ended up addicted to pain pills, morphine. And the doctor, I can't believe, gave me morphine. But I just kept going back and saying, this isn't really working very well. Couldn't do that these days.
No.
But they just kept giving me stronger and stronger medicine. And then I ran out, and they weren't going to give me any more. And so I went through withdrawal, and it was a crazy experience. And this is a weird time in my life. I lived alone. My father worked in Chicago, and I lived in Indiana. But he hadn't sold the house, so I just lived in the house. It was this fairly large house. And I had a lot of time for contemplation. I developed a meditation practice and a lot of contemplation, but still didn't have any sense of direction or purpose in my life. And so I moved back to Virginia and started to cultivate a sense of purpose. And it still had something to do with music. I thought I was like, well, if I'm not going to play music, maybe I'll run sound, do sound engineering. And that sort of turned into production work, stage production, working with a theater, and then I ended up working with an opera company. And meanwhile, I was bartending and working the door as a bouncer at a local bar in that small town in Virginia I was living in. And I started experimenting with sound frequencies and a variety of different supplements. There was this one particular supplement, colloidal gold, and this company that was making it was extraordinary. They were the only company I found that had actual testing done on their product, and what they found was an increase by somewhere around 33% in IQ after 3 months of usage. So I bought a bunch of this stuff and I was using it daily.
Does it still work now? Can I still get some?
They discontinued the product. The company doesn't make it anymore. Yeah, I know. It's so disappointing. But it worked. Wow. During this 6-month period where I was taking this stuff, I had purchased a program to create my own binaural beats. And so I had these long programs that I would run, and I had my bed surrounded with speakers and a subwoofer. And binaural beats are better with headphones, but you can still effective if you have the polarity of the speakers next to you on either side. And so I would create these long projects with this, and they'd run for 8 hours. And so it would run for 8 hours, and then I'd sleep for another 8, because I was sending my body into these deep delta states or theta states, wow, and then sometimes in alpha states, and I could pre-program it to ramp between these two. And it was really a whole lot of fun. And taking the colloidal gold, I started to notice that my ability to intuit personality or emotional fluctuations or what was going on with people, like reading body language, just suddenly developed. Mm. And people would seek me out to talk to me about their problems. And my mom had gone back to school for counseling at this point, and she kept nudging me. She's like, you should go to school for psychology. You should go to school for psychology. You'd be a natural at this. And I just did not enjoy traditional education.
Yeah. And
so I tried going back to school. I was like, all right, I'm going to study anthropology. Couldn't do it. It wasn't that I couldn't. My learning style and creative style just wasn't suited to the way that traditional education is structured. I love to learn, though. So I did a lot of my own learning. I went and I bought some textbooks on psychology and started studying anatomy and physiology.
You're like self-taught. I
Self-taught.
don't need to go back to school, Mom.
That's right.
I'm going to do it myself without you.
Exactly. Yep. So, I'm working in production, sound engineering, and that turned into working with a couple of really incredible opera companies, doing stage management and not stage management with the opera, but stage management with a symphony and production work with an opera company. And I knew that at some point I probably would work with other people, but I didn't know how it would take shape. And I started working with some mentors. It was the first personal mentors I just really immersed myself in work with. I had done some other trainings prior to that. I did a Reiki training and some other stuff. But they were astrologers, but they were Jungian psychologists first. And one of them was a Jungian, one of them was an Ericksonian. So Milton Erickson was one of the people that the founders of NLP modeled after. So his induction or hypnotic work was infused in neurolinguistic programming. And so Michael Brady is his name, and his wife, Linda, worked in tandem with me to teach me astrology. But I learned astrology by dissecting my life through my chart. And they used this more like a Socratic tool than they did predictive. And so my mother gifted me a retreat with them one year after Christmas. And I went and I was already enrolled in a 3-year program, like a correspondence program with Linda, and she was teaching us astrology. She'd come twice a year to the house, and we'd gather together, and then we would do correspondence work with her. So I go down and I spend a weekend with them. And while I'm there, we just deconstruct my life while also learning about archetypes and this other language.
And this is through the lens of astrology. Yeah.
They use astrology as the entry point, but then they do therapeutic processing work.
Yeah.
And
because it sort of feels like a low-hanging fruit entry point, or more interesting to people who could be resistant to it, or just because it's a great lens to say, let's start from something where we see where the stars are aligned. And
they were really drawn to it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly.
Someone recently read my chart, and a convalence of another chart and all these things. And I thought, I don't know how many times in my life I've really had a chart read like that, but it wasn't like, look in my crystal ball vibes.
Yeah.
It was very much like, here's what's going on. Actually, what she said to me is, you're like the guy who's you're like the concerto violinist who's playing the violin in the subway. You're playing to the wrong audience, Kristen. It was really interesting notes to come out of it. But like you said, nothing predictive of what's to come, where I think we think of that sometimes, my horoscope or something.
There are a couple different kinds of astrology, right? So there is a predictive astrology where you're looking at the chart and then you're projecting outward, and you're using that as a tool to sort of fortune tell. And it's not really fortune telling. It's more based on the energies of these things, but this is a potentiality, depending on how you interact with the world. Linda was very avidly against predictive astrology. She did something she calls karmic astrology. And that is studying the journey of the soul and using the symbols or the archetypes in the chart as a means of stimulating deeper knowing and understanding of ourselves. And Michael and Linda together, more Michael than Linda, would then bring in the body with feelings. Mad, sad, glad, scared, or ashamed are the 5 that he would use. And so that was my entry point to beginning to notice how an emotion created a physical reaction in my body and how disconnected I was. But the process of learning astrology was extraordinary, because it wasn't just these symbols and their meanings. It was how everything in life has like a texture or some sort of myth or poetic kind of thing about it. And so I learned how to interpret symbology or symbols leaves or trees or animals, and to interpret it without needing a book to tell me about the creature itself or about the plant, but to be able to read something in that way. And so this weekend, we have this immersive weekend together. And I'm like, guys, how do I learn? How do I study with you? And they're like, you are studying with me. And they're doing telephone calls with sessions, and they're getting paid. And we're getting paid like $100, $120 an hour. And I was like, this is genius. It's the first model for something like this I've ever seen. And at the time, I think I was making $25, maybe $30 an hour if I was lucky. And $150 an hour seemed like that was a big deal. And so I'm like, teach me how to do this. Teach me how to do this. I think I would be good at it. And she's like, yeah, we are. You're enrolled. I'm like, no. But how could I apprentice with you? I want to live with you for a while. Like, can't I live with you and shadow you and have you teach me? And they're like, we've never done anything like that before. Well, it's like, well, but what if you did? And I'm really persistent when it comes to these things, and I'm not afraid to ask. And that's one thing that's always been true about me. If I want something, my ego doesn't get in the way of me just saying, hey, could I have that? Mm-hmm. It may not be maybe socially like appropriate.
A hard no, but right. You're like, I'm going to ask.
Like, I'm going to ask. Yeah. So I asked her, I said, well, couldn't we create like a month-long immersive experience? She said, I don't think you could afford it. All right. So we go to bed, sleep on it. The next morning, not really thinking anything of it. And she says, I've given some thought to this. If you can have another person join us, we'll do this in our cabin in Vermont. It's a 2-bedroom cabin with a loft. We can all spend a month together there. And so I quickly send out a message to the group of people, the cohort we're all learning from, and one of the women says yes. And so for an unbelievably reasonable amount of money, we spent a month living with Linda and Michael. And this woman who's since passed, she and her son, who was 15 at the time, Kathy is her name, and she and her son stayed in one of the rooms, and I stayed in a loft. And Linda and Michael stayed in their bedroom, and we were all there together for 40 days, actually.
Wow.
A nice long stint together. And we'd start at 8 in the morning, and we'd go to about 5 p.m. And then Linda would take private calls with her clients in the evenings for a couple hours. And sometimes she'd take them during the day, and Michael would take over and do some hypnosis training with us. So we learned how to do past life regression, hypnotic induction, language patterns for hypnotic work. And that was teaching me how to Michael has this way, when he does something he calls unconscious indirection, where you're speaking or telling a story in a way that kind of confuses the logical mind, but you're actually saying something underneath it that's speaking to the unconscious. And he would do it with me, and I loved it when I could track it when he was doing it, but I'd be like, this is hilarious. Great, tell me a long story, it's fine. But I learned so much from that time, and I came out of it like, okay, I could really do this. And so I started working with clients almost immediately, and very quickly realized that I wanted more training.
Yeah.
That was just the tip of the iceberg.
And what would you say to the client, like when you were like going to fields to get clients, would you say, I just want to work on your psyche, or would you dive more deeply into sort of some framework?
So we would use astrology as an entry point.
Yeah.
And then I would do hypnotic induction or regression work with them, present life or sometimes past life regression work. And some of my first clients were patients of my mother's. She brought me in to do some work with some of her clients, or her clients hired me to do some work with them.
Yeah.
And I did some couples work with a couple in tandem with this woman, Kathy, all while getting support and supervision from Michael and Linda. What I realized was that even though I had an astrology framework, I didn't know how to operate a business, and I didn't know how to find clients. And I was confident, but there was so much I recognized I didn't know. My first website talked about, it was so philosophic, like talking about, the unconscious and soul and all sorts of pieces like this. And it's beautiful and poetic.
But now they're like, you need to speak in a language that a fifth grader can understand on your website so that people can move through and hire you.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. That gave me a taste of doing something that was so natural. And it was through my own inner self-exploration that I found my way there. Mm. So this roundabout long way of answering your question would be to say, it's been a long process of becoming this attuned and this resonant with myself so that I can then be that way with others. From that point in my career, I dove headlong into a coach training, and then I went and I lived in Peru and I studied shamanism, ayahuasca, and then I immersed myself in the somatic experiencing training and a variety of other adjunct trainings beyond that. And that's where I learned the nuance of trauma, of working with trauma. And so this distinction that you made when we began was around the difference between trauma aware and trauma informed and trauma trained. And this is a distinction we make in the trauma and somatics training. Trauma aware is many people. Trauma is one of those things that we hear more about on podcasts. People are talking about it more. In fact, Rich Roll was talking about it on one of the clips that I saw from his today, and a couple of other folks who I follow who are in very different industries are having people talk about it on their podcasts. Gabor Mate has made the rounds in the entrepreneurial communities. That means that we're aware that trauma exists. It's there. We know about it. We've read some books. Maybe we've read The Body Keeps the Score or Waking the Tiger. We're like, I know trauma exists. But that's different than being trauma informed, at least the way we make the distinction. Trauma informed, the way we define it is, I know what it is and I know what it looks like and how it presents in a person. And I know what to do should it show up in my containers when I'm working with others. And that only comes from a much deeper exploration and training in these things. And one of the things that we do that's maybe a little different than some of the other companies out there is we teach about nervous system physiology, because the polyvagal theory, we believe, is a really, really useful theory and explanation of how the science of safety and connection functions, but how that works in the body. And when we understand that, we can track autonomic expressions, the way that the body presents symptoms of various different autonomic states. And that can be really good information for how to modulate the work that we're doing. And particularly for the people who you work with and who maybe are students of yours. And I'm sure you probably teach about some of these elements of the autonomic nervous system, but being able to track that and know what to do when that thing shows up, it's like the difference between knowing CPR and not knowing CPR. And that's a really good analogy for it. Like, well, I know the difference and I hardly ever have to use it, but God, man, those few moments when I've needed to use it makes all the difference in the world. I know what to do. I'm calm, I'm collected, I know how to meet the situation. And then we have trauma trained, which is I can treat it. I know how to treat it. I have had hundreds of hours of training. I've had hundreds of hours of supervision. I regularly receive supervision from experts, neuroscientists, trauma specialists, and so on and so forth. And I know how to support a person's body through an arc to help their system process that living memory. And so let's define trauma real quick for
Yeah, I'd like to. Big T, can you first talk about big T, then little t?
Why don't I define it first and then, and then kind of parse that out?
I sort of half jokingly said that because people will say, it's not really a big T trauma. It's not like the best thing. So I was telling you earlier that I'm doing a little therapy now, and the best thing that my EMDR therapist, the standard operating procedure, I think, is like, make a list. bring it to the next session. And the most important question she ever asked me was, after I brought the list, do you think you have trauma? And I was like, whoa, I made the list because you asked me to make the list, but it's not, like, I think what I said to her was, it's not like someone held me down when I was like 5 and just burned me with cigarettes or something, right. Which is just like an interesting, like at the moment I heard that come out of my mouth, I was like, oh, the point that she's trying to make to me and that I've just realized, it's like up until this moment, I was like saying, not really, or it's not as important as other people's traumas, or at 5, it could just be something like a dog jumping up on me. Like I got sniffed and bitten by a dog when I was young, and that created that memory, right?
Yeah.
And so letting myself off the hook. And I say that story because I think there are many people who will be listening to this feeling similarly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I can relate.
Yeah.
I mean, I can now honestly say, yes, I experienced a lot of trauma in my teenage years. Yeah. But for the longest time, no, I didn't have trauma. Things were hard.
I'm fine. Yeah,
I'm fine. Well, things were hard, but people had it far worse.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So let's define trauma.
I'll sort of passively quote Gabor Mate because I think he does a really good job of describing this in simple terms. And he's had a lot of practice. And he says, trauma is not what happens to us. It's what happens inside us in reaction to or as a result of what happens to us. So it's not the event. It's not a series of events. It's the reaction inside our body that says, this is too much for me to process. So Peter Levine's more technical definition is it's the lingering psychosomatic response to overwhelming events. Right? But that's more technical. But it's the living memory of something that was too much. Now, that could be repeatedly not getting my needs met, so needing an adaptive survival response. It could be a shocking moment where that overloads my body's system. It's not able to process it. It's not watching a movie and being triggered. It's not somebody saying something to us. And most of the time, it's not the stressful moments that we call trauma. It's when the body formulates an adaptive response or reaction to something that's too much. And that becomes embedded as a new reflexive reaction to something. Here's a good example that one of my trainers in Somatic Experiencing, his name's Burns Galloway, he shared this with us in the class, and it really helped to make sense of it for me. He said, imagine you come out of your home onto the city streets. It's a beautiful day. You look up into the sky. Oh, it's so beautiful. And then there's a flash of red, and you wake up and you're in the hospital. And you begin your healing process. You don't know what happened. They say, well, a truck came out of nowhere and hit you. You've been in there for 2 weeks. You come out of it, and you start to work your way to recovery. Your body recovers, your mind recovers. And then 6 months later, you find that you're having a really hard time. You go out to a party, and for some reason, when you're around certain people, you feel really angry, edgy. Like you want to fight them, or you want to run away. You're just really agitated. And more time goes by, and this keeps happening. And you notice that when people wear the color red, you start to get really triggered. Right? And so the trigger is the reaction in the body. The stimulus is the color, for instance, or something in the environment. And this is the body stuck, unable to process the moment when something too much occurred. And then there's a coupling, is what we call it, or like neurons that fire together, wire together. They've become wired together. So every time this person, or every time let's say I'm this person, every time I'm around somebody wearing the color red, my body goes back into that fight-flight response because it's unprocessed. The body had to go into a shutdown, an immobilized state for survival, to preserve my life. But I wasn't able to run away from the threat. And so when we're working to resolve that, we very gently help the system to unwind those stuck reactions. And trauma is that stuck reaction. Now, that's an example of a shocking moment. But trauma can also be relational. So it could be, a series of events during childhood when we're not getting our needs met over and over and over again. So we form an adaptive reaction to that, where we've learned that when we have needs, if we ask for them, we're not going to get them met. So we go and take care of ourselves and self-soothe that way. Right? And then we call that avoidant attachment style. But that is an adaptive response to a set of circumstances where, for our survival, we had to create an adaptation. And we've, created categories for these things. But that's a response to something that was little t trauma. It's a series of things over time. And
that response was something that was protective, and that was something that helped people cope, function, right? And in their youth or in their childhood.
Yeah, we survived because we have these. So what I'll often say to people is, there's something wrong with me. I need to fix this. There's something wrong. I've got to fix the thing that's wrong because it's affecting my life. It's affecting my relationships. No, something's right with you. Something's right with you. That's how you survived. And that's the right thing for your body to do in those moments. The difficulty comes when we're stuck there.
Yeah, and that's sort of this patterning, like with the example of the red, that your body recognized that color and it just says, well, last time we had the color red show up, this crazy thing happened that makes me want to flee. Yeah. And so I'm just going to flee.
Yeah. Yeah, this is life or death.
Yeah.
I've got a guy that I sort of became friends with for a little while, and I haven't spoken to him in a while. His name's Russ Kennedy. He wrote a book called Anxiety RX. Russ is amazing. He's a neuroscientist. And Russ says, we've got two different kinds of memory, and for simplification's sake, we're going to be super simple about this. One is explicit, one's implicit. Implicit memory is something that's a sensing that occurs, right? And usually that's encoded through the amygdala during high stress in moments. So it's a real-time active memory. It's something that we feel like a reaction or an impulse. And evolutionarily speaking, that's useful because if we have a sense or we smell a threat, our body will just run away, or it'll just fight. It'll protect us without us thinking about it. So that's implicit memory. And then
in a state, in an awareness that it's there, like we're hyper aware that it's happening.
Could be,
that
maybe
thing
not.
is coming up. Maybe not. Okay.
Yeah, maybe not. It's useful in so much as we don't have to think about reacting. The reaction occurs without our thought process at all. Mm-hmm. Sort of like breathing occurs without us thinking about it. So it's an autonomic response. But then we have explicit memory, which is encoded in the hippocampus. And usually there's a time date stamp on that. With trauma, there's not usually a time and a date stamp associated with the physiological reaction. So it's just floating around, and something in our environment appears the same as the moment where a life-threatening situation was occurring, and our body goes, danger, threat, and it mounts the reaction again to protect us from the potential threat that's not actually in the room with us. But that's living on inside of us, and that's trauma.
Yeah, it can be brought on by a sight, a smell, a sound, a thing, etc.
Exactly. A relationship. Yeah, a song. Yeah. Anything. The reaction comes up, and there we are, we're in it. This distinction is really important because language matters, and sometimes what I find is many people, I say sometimes many, but I've found that there have been people who get this confused. People come through our program and they'll say, I was so traumatized with this thing. And I say, well, maybe you were triggered by it. Maybe something in the environment triggered a reaction in you that's real. And that felt big. Right? Doesn't mean anything's wrong is happening in the environment. If I said something or I did something and you felt triggered, I wouldn't take responsibility for your feelings, but I would take responsibility for the impact of what I did. And that's that subtle distinction around, around those things. And when we're working with other people, especially in the context of helping or healing, depending on what we want to call it, we want to pay attention to the nuance of these things, because when so for breath or for cold, we're going to be stimulating an autonomic response in the body. It's going to be a state change of some kind. And when that state change occurs, the body we might stimulate an associated state. And oftentimes we see emotional reactions, all sorts of physiological responses. And I see this in session work too. And so we want to be prepared to be able to modulate how deep we go with each person based on the person's capacity. And that's much more difficult when we're doing large groups. So when we're doing large groups, having more than one person to track the room is really great. I'm sure you already know this.
Yeah, I would love to I'd love to bring a space holder in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then if it's just us, we're able to watch everybody. And what we often say in trauma and somatics is, we can only move as fast as our slowest part can go. And that means that when we're doing group work, we can only go as deep as the shallowest person can go. Now we can do a lot with inviting modulation for people and encouraging them to pause where they need to pause, and directive language around modulating things, and knowing that some people are going to have more capacity than others and they may go deeper. But that permissive, rather than prescriptive approach is extraordinary. And that's what we need when we have a history of trauma. And the world, we're all traumatized to some degree or another. And the more I understand the technicality of this, the more I'm recognizing, okay, this is just a word, just like the ancient mystics in the East would say attachment. I know it's not the same thing culturally, but letting go of our attachments, or letting go of the things that are stuck inside of us. Even Ram Dass sort of talked about these kinds of things, right? It's not so easy as just letting go. But those things are what bind us here, and it's the pain that we carry with us, and that's what trauma is. And as we go through life, we have to adapt to circumstances, because that's what life is. Life is that process of adaptation. And so, supporting an individual to make contact with that without it overwhelming them, that's where the real gold and the real magic lies.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about this thing with groups as well, because it's something that comes up often. Where I'll say if you're planning for a group, you want to plan to the median of the room to at least understand that you're not going to ever plan to the most, I don't even want to say advanced, because that's sort of weird, but like the person that's like skilled and ready to just be like an open vessel. You can't plan to that, because that's never going to work, right? Yeah. And that might even be scary for other people who are in the space. So if it's not an individualized approach, or you don't have the ability to do that with groups, it's like plan for the median and then watch and see what's happening in the space. And it's so, I think this is where putting reps in matters, It
does, yeah.
Just putting reps in to see and feel and be with people. I have a couple of people in the mentorship now that are like, hey, this is great. I'm going to volunteer at an addiction recovery center. Because it's just a wider swath of people that are navigating some challenges, and being able to spend time in those spaces so that you can go slow to go fast.
Yeah. Well, and I like that you're saying this, right? So there are two little things that you said there that I want to sort of expand on. One, which I was going to speak to, is, kind of correlating, and we were talking about this earlier before we sat down, correlating progressive growth with exercise. So when we're working with an individual who has a history of trauma and that's getting triggered, what we really want to be doing is figuring out where their 70% is and backing them down even maybe a little bit more than that, and modulating intensity so that they can be with where they're like under their threshold of intensity capacity. And that's where the real magic occurs. Just like in a gym, everybody has a different capacity. In, a calisthenics class, maybe, for instance, or something else, everybody's going to have different capacity. We're not all going to be able to do the same weights. We're not all going to be able to do the same reps. And there's this permission in those environments and encouragement to find your edge. And then sometimes in certain more like, rough environments, push past it, right? And what I'm saying here isn't suggesting that we don't do hard things. It's suggesting that we do hard things, but within our window of capacity, so that we don't destroy the muscle tissue and not be able to work out again for a week, so that we don't do too little and not develop ourselves, but so that we find that sweet spot where there's just enough stress that we're working hard, but not so much that we're overwhelmed. And when we're working with the body's memory around stress and overwhelm, that line is so nuanced. What we think might be not too much is going to be way too much for somebody else. So my capacity is like, I don't even base what somebody else can do off of what I can do, because my capacity is going to be very different than theirs, right? And so instead, I've become trained to watch their body and to recognize when they're hitting the enough point and help them to modulate at that enough point.
Yeah.
And that's the sweet spot. And it's just like exercise. There are visual objective cues that we can watch in an individual's body and go, they're at the edge. Don't go any further. Stay at that edge. Breathe a little less. Slow it down a little bit. Right? Right there. You don't have to slow it down anymore. Just right there. So hang out right there. Something new is occurring. The body's growing. The body's learning. And that's what we want. We want learning. We want growth. We want new development to occur. But it occurs in that sweet spot, in that little zone. And it doesn't occur above that zone.
Yeah. It's like not the sledgehammer. Nobody needs a sledgehammer or the 40-minute ice bath.
Well, right.
Because there's a notion of like the re-traumatization of someone by being in a circumstance for too far long or too intense that all of a sudden it's doing more harm than good, and maybe even creating more blocks to getting through it.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah.
And that's like that's also very, it's hard for me to not relate it all to the ice bath, because I always see
So true.
it's like 3 minutes and you have someone in the cold and you're like, okay, I can see your entire life and how you navigate stress across the board.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I first discovered ice, I was like, I'm going to do 6 minutes. I'm going to do 12 minutes. I did like 16 minutes once. And I was so proud of myself.
And then she was so sad later. You're like, oh.
Thankfully, I didn't have a horrible reaction, but I did need to move a lot afterwards.
Yeah. You got to move a lot to get things going.
But it was like that, can I push myself hard? How far can I push myself thing? And then I realized that really I just needed to modulate. And 3 to 4 minutes was more than enough.
Yeah.
Especially because my body didn't need all that extra.
Yeah.
It wasn't about a peak experience.
Yeah.
For the longest time in my life, I chased peak experiences. I mean, I once ate 100 hits of acid and drove across the United States. And I would never recommend doing that.
Yeah. And I think we do that as a species. We have, most of us have some kind of competitive nature. Like, well, what would happen if?
Right.
There's some of that in there, mixed in there as well. And there's definitely times that I've like pushed things too fast or too hard, or I don't know, passed out in a breathwork thing, or riding the edges. But this is also minimum effective dose. And this is also what I tend to see when people are muscling through it, which is what I will call it quite often, is that it's almost like the muscling through it is actually not serving the expansion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just like, I'm going to do this the way I've always done it, or just like kind of force myself, or whatever they do to tune out. And I don't just mean in the ice. I mean like in a circumstance, and then not learning a new navigation because they're just in a very typical mode that they might be in, not good or bad necessarily, but not any different, not anything that's expansive.
Yeah.
Which for me is sort of the reason I like to do this work with breath and with cold as the vehicles to self-realization and actualization, is because they're tools with which we can get to a place where we can almost gain awareness that, oh, this is that moment. What do I decide to do, right? Eventually, maybe not in our first class or our first ice bath or whatever it might be. And that's like the rub, right? Mm-hmm. Is that we can still be like, I championed 22 minutes, Joe Rogan. And then it's like, cool. And you're still kind of the same person.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Well, and that was the next thing I was going to kind of speak to that you said earlier, slow down to go fast. I've been listening to a book by Wayne Dyer, where
Oh, my mom loves Wayne Dyer.
I just love that guy. I listen to him.
He's great. And she shoved CDs down my throat so much when I was in my teens that I was like,
no more.
I'm not going to, don't, if she said, do not listen to Wayne Dyer, I would be all in.
Yep. Well, I was listening to him. I just love listening to his voice. I'm like, could you be my dad? No, but he did his own translation of the Tao Te Ching. And it's really quite beautiful. And he's not saying something that's new. And it's something that I've kind of come to my own understanding of without ever being immersed in that particular culture, so we could say. But this doing less doesn't mean that we don't exert effort. This slowing down to go fast, it's paradoxical in nature, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go slow. It means more that we're intentional with what we do. And so there's presence with us in each step. Sometimes we're moving quickly, physically, but we're present with the movement. And so I can make quick movements, but be present with them, and it's still like I'm moving slow. And so it's about the state of being of us on the inside while we're with what we're with. And the other thing I'll say about the speed is nature is slow. It is not in our nature to move at the speed of technology. Nature is much slower. And do you know Adrian Grenier? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Adrian's whole thing about Earth speed. I love that. Because in a way, that's the natural disposition of the organism, of us as organisms. But we're caught up in technology. And we come to healing and transformation with an assumption that we need to do it the way we do technology. Rapidly, quickly, effectively. But
how much longer until I'm cured?
Right. Exactly that.
I mean, while you're talking, I'm just like, I'm having a little self-shame over here, but it's fine. Because it's like, we're impatient.
Yeah.
Well, I think generally speaking as a people, because of technology and many things, are impatient. But also, I'm super impatient. So this is a beautiful reminder for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the slowing down to go quickly is this more philosophical point, which is when I let go of forcing something, it happens faster. Mm-hmm. Because I'm not applying control and constriction and effort. Although I'm with it still, in a way. Somehow it unfolds in a new way. The seed doesn't force itself to grow. It knows when to do what it does. The flower doesn't think about blooming. It just does when it's ready. We are the same. We're organic matter. We're a part of the ecosystem, even though we feel disconnected and we're living outside of the rhythm of it. But when we're really rooted in that, and we remember, when we return to that part of ourselves, there's a practice when it comes to trusting that process. But it unfolds beautifully. Maybe not even beautifully. It just unfolds naturally. Our job's to get out of the way. There's a quote from Anthony de Mello that I think I've changed a little bit from when he said it in one of his lectures. And he's quoting, I think, a Sufi. And we begin our training with this quote in tandem with the Joseph Campbell quote. But this quote points to the nature of somatics, in my opinion. And it's when the eye is unobstructed, the result is sight. When the ear is unobstructed, the result is hearing. When the mouth is unobstructed, the result is taste. And when the nose is unobstructed, the result is smell. When the mind is unobstructed, the result is wisdom. And when the heart is unobstructed, the result is love. And this process of transforming, or healing, or waking up is not about adding things in. It's about removing that which is the barrier for us to notice what's real. It's about removing the barriers between us and the world, feeling each other, feeling ourselves, contentment. And usually the barrier is some sort of stress or some sort of trauma or some sort of difficulty that we are having trouble feeling, that we don't have the skill yet developed to tolerate inside of us. And just like with exercise, we can tolerate more weight by doing incremental growth. It's the same when it comes to self-awareness and feeling and being with our emotions and our memories and our sensory experience. And so progressively, when we practice returning again and again and again, it feels like nothing's happening. But then we look backwards 6 months and we can see, holy shit, I'm not the same. I'm stronger. My muscles are more developed. My body looks more, I'm a different looking body, but I feel the same inside.
And it's like almost like, how did I get here?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's one small step at a time. And the steps are so small that it doesn't seem like we're doing anything at all. And so I say that to the part of you right now that was just kind of showing up like beating yourself up. Oh my God, I really want to be there fast. Well, we all do. I mean, you're not alone in that.
Yeah, of course.
We all do. And also, if we remove some of our assumptions about ourselves, we can actually notice, oh, I really am different than I was 6 months ago. I'm in that progressively growing state. And so I'm going to tie this into what we're talking about here for your listeners, which is going big with big peak experiences being the objective can give somebody an experience that they might talk about. But that's not what helps a person to develop themselves. It gives them a wow experience. But on the other side of the wow experience, they're back where they are. Yeah. And if you really want to help somebody change, give them a practice, an incremental practice that develops them, that develops their skill, that develops their mental agility, that develops their physical capacity. And what you'll see is that they will change in massive ways. We just have to be patient enough to walk beside them for a while so that it can happen. But when we train a person to train themselves, they will become lifelong, avid champions of what we've given them.
Mm. Yeah, and do you think that there's a notion that we're missing stillness to do some of this work? I think the hardest thing that for myself, sure, but also sometimes the hardest thing when looking for client adherence or to work with somebody, the hardest thing for them to adhere to, because, I will work in nutrition and fitness and all the things around the landscape of breath and cold, is any sort of stillness practices. If it's very like consistent, down-regulatory, easeful breathing that's not, going off the rails, if it's meditation, right? There's like so much resistance to that I think, I'm curious to think if you think it's just from social media, technology, all those things. I love what you talked about going more slowly. And there's some story about a king who's telling his people he's all late for the party or whatever. And he's like, stop, dress me slowly. Mm-hmm. And it's not about not getting to the party on time. It's about if his court is going to dress him and they rush, they're going to mess the buttons up, or it's just going to take longer in the long run anyway.
Yeah. When we are in a hurry, we're not present with where we are.
Yeah.
But we can still get somewhere quickly if we move methodically.
Yeah.
Right. But then we have presence with our movements. And I contemplate this piece around presence and fragmented attention spans. And I think social media has a huge effect on this. Media in general, advertising, television, the amount of sensory input that we have to contend with is light years beyond 2 generations ago. Just 2 generations. It's not that long ago.
I know. And here comes AI, ladies and gentlemen.
50, 60 years ago. Not even that, really.
Yeah.
When you and I were kids, there
was no iPhone.
World. Yeah. There was no cell phone, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a completely different world. We used our imagination. We were outside.
I made mud pies. Does anyone make a mud pie anymore?
No. Kids wouldn't know where to begin. They don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah.
I think that has a part of, like a piece of it. We don't have space or gaps When people stand in line, they don't think. They look at their phone. They fill the space. They don't talk to each other. They fill the space with some sort of input. So one of the greatest gifts we could give ourselves is a form of stillness where we sit and do nothing. And sometimes I give this as a prescription to clients, especially the high performers. I'll say, okay, so your assignment is to put a block in your calendar of nothing. You got to block it in.
And they're like, what do I do?
That's right. Nothing. Lay down on the floor and notice where you're stiff. And do that for 20 minutes on your back and wait for your body to relax. It might not. See what happens. That's a practice.
Yeah, that's a good one, though. It's a beauty.
Mm-hmm. Go for a walk. Leave all technology at home. Don't take anything with you.
Count the number of times you touch your pocket,
That's
your
right.
empty pocket.
That's right. That's right.
When I go to Burning Man, it's really, because there are times that I leave technology and I go rucking or I do something, but at Burning Man, because it's such an extended period of time with and in the early years, I didn't even bring a phone around because it wasn't like taking good pictures. I'd have like a camera,
right.
And my phone was back at the RV or back at the tent. And the first like 24 to 36 hours is just so interesting because you find yourself in these moments where you're like, oh, you either want to capture something or you want to, but you're grabbing for it, even though there's nothing and no reason because you're with your friends and you're like, but you're still doing the reach and then slowly as that unfolds after day 1 or 2 or you hit day 3 and you're just like, oh, I can take in everything. It's no surprise that it's such a wonder at that point because you're shifted out of that looking for the thing that was feeding, whether it's dopamine or whatever. And also there's plenty of things that are creating dopamine in that environment as well, but in a different creative space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, just allowing our body to have like the wonder again. There's a practice that I'll sometimes give to clients where it's go sit outside near a tree and look at it and take it in as if it's the first time you ever saw it, and don't use words to name what you're looking at, and see if you can look at it without words. Can you take it in with no thought? No, probably not. But see if you can find little glimmers of moments where you're observing the shapes. It's no longer a tree. It's not bark. It's not leaves. It's this something that has no words. Can we take it in from that perspective? Something is different when we take in the world with that kind of wonder. Anthony Mello shares a story. He said, the first time a child sees a bird and somebody says sparrow, sparrow, they've robbed that child of the beauty and wonder of the world. Because the next time that child sees a fluffy flying object, they're going to say sparrow. It's now a word. It's not this fluffy flying creature. Mm-hmm. And we're robbing ourselves, and language does this, and it's just part of us living in language. But can we take in our environment like that? Can we don't have enough stillness to do that. I'm talking about these practices that were probably so much easier 1,000 years ago, because the world we lived in didn't require our attention in the same way.
Yeah.
Contemplation, if you had enough wealth, you could sit in contemplation, and contemplation wouldn't be necessarily a hard thing, air quotes.
Yeah.
We'd have to be predisposed to being intelligent enough and whatnot, but we're in a different era now where we need a prescription to go and take time away from technology and stimulation.
Yeah, people go on vacation and they spend the whole vacation sick because they haven't given themselves any space before the holiday, and they're like, "Why am I now at this tropical beach and I am stuck in my hotel room?"
Sick. Or
a little of it. When you're speaking about these things, it harkens back to this TED talk that I won't remember her name, of the woman who I don't want to say I had envy of it, but it was so interesting to me because I thought, what would that be like? And I think there's very rare moments in my life that have touched that. So a woman I think she's a neuroscientist, and she had a stroke.
Yes. I know exactly what you're talking about.
And it's such a beautiful, scary, I imagine, story, but also the beauty of it being so meta that she could be in this moment where she's talking about she's in the bathroom and she's trying to figure out the phone, and all perception of that being a phone is gone, you know? And you suggested the book to me that's Neuroscience Keeping Up with Buddhism.
Yeah, No Self, No Problem is the name of the book. Modern neuroscientists' take on Buddhism.
Oh my, I've recommended that book to like 15 people and listened to the audiobook, and it's so helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are meaning-making machines. We are meaning-making machines. It's so helpful to really understand how the brain works. It gave me a lot of like grace and forgiveness and thinking, okay, my mind is just making shit up the whole time anyway, like to solve the problem that isn't even exactly the problem that it thinks it has. It's like, yes, No Self, No Problem. That was like a top 5 recommendation book of my life.
Yeah, it was amazing. I forget who recommended it to me, but yeah, it was similar for me. I'm like, oh my God, perfectly stated.
Yeah.
And he speaks it in the religion of the modern age, which is science.
Yeah.
You know, and that is a universal language right now in the world where we can understand it. But explaining it that way, the role of the left hemisphere of the brain is simply to catalog and correlate and make meaning. That's great. And then the role of the right hemisphere is this intuitive, immersive, like present moment awareness. And these Eastern practices of present moment awareness involve giving the mind a job so that it will get out of the way. Yeah. One of the foundational practices that we use in the trauma and somatics training is something we call a soma check-in. And this is essentially a practice of noticing what's happening in our body. We notice our sensations and we notice what we're experiencing emotionally. And we use language like, in my body. So, for your listeners, in my body, I notice, and then we fill in the blank with a sensation like I'm prickly or I'm warm or I'm cool or I'm tight. Right? So in my body, I notice, and I use the word notice because it's not visual, it's not auditory, and it's not kinesthetic. And I'm experiencing, then we name an emotion: joy, sadness, pain, grief, anger. And I name an emotion of some kind. And then we do this practice multiple times a day. And what you'll notice when you do this practice for the first couple times is that your brain will say, it'll try to say I'm feeling, but we don't use the word feeling because feeling confuses thought and emotion and sensation. And we use that word interchangeably to talk about all the things. I feel like, and then we're going to tell a story, which is an interpretation. And so for the sake of practicing something differently, we give the mind something to do, which is to observe, and we name it without any meaning attached. And we get into the practice of withholding meaning. And that brain can go crazy at first when we start to do this practice. But what ends up happening over time is that we can start to observe things objectively. And we can catch ourselves going, I'm cold because I had that second cup of coffee. Or I'm tight because I'm stressed. Or maybe not.
But sort of widening the lens. Yeah. And then not specifically saying feelings, but talking about sensations. Yeah.
And emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the word feeling, are we telling a story about what we think? Most people do. I feel like you just blah, 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 blah. I feel like this thing, that thing, right? We use I feel statements before we tell a story about some ideas or some thoughts that we have.
When I'm like a lot of times in my life, I had a pattern of saying it feels hard.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, is it feel hard? Like, what does that really mean?
Yeah.
Because there's something deeper there, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels hard. Well, what does that feel like?
Yeah.
It's actually not a feeling, it's a concept.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm stuck. I don't know what to think or what to say. But there is a feeling. We also don't practice noticing our bodies in our culture. We don't practice noticing the sensations that are there and giving language to them. We don't practice naming our emotions. That can be really hard for people.
Yeah.
I don't know what emotion I'm experiencing right now. Well, there's always something there.
There's always something there, yeah.
And there's always some sort of sensory experience happening.
Yeah, I've done a lot of processing work just about expanding my range of language around feelings and needs. And there's like lots of those practices in there that really being like, oh, well, what is the thing that I need right, to get to that, to unpack that.
Identifying
as a
our
process.
needs that's a skill. It takes time.
Yeah, and then can you imagine then we have to actually ask for them?
Yeah. We have to risk somebody saying no. We have to risk the pain that maybe we experienced a long time ago that had us not ask for our needs. There's that inherent risk every time we go to do that.
There's one thing I want to just make sure we touch on. That's an important point, in your opinion, is so valuable to me in this, which is just speaking about people who are showing up in our containers where we're working, our businesses, or with other, clients as helpers or healers. When someone, like, when is the point when it's important to know or understand how to, hey, I want to keep working with you on this, and also I need to refer out, or how far is too far? There's questions that come up from time to time around people who don't want to be touched. And like, I'm a firm believer, as long as there is a consensual understanding, we can still use cueing. They can use self-touch. There's other things. But where do where's a good place for people who are listening to this, especially people in the coaching container, to say, hey, this is a situation where I need to move this on to someone who has more of a professional landscape.
The easiest,
or clinical landscape, maybe even, I don't know.
Yeah, the easiest way to know is, am I trained to treat what's happening? Do I have extensive training to treat the symptoms that are present? If the answer is no, then I want to support the individual in the way that I know how and suggest, hey, there's this thing coming up. Let's talk about getting you some extra support with this. Doesn't mean that we stop working together, but it means like, let's work together to get you some extra support. I think this thing would be really helpful with these things that are coming up for you.
Yeah.
And then
like a good example might be like, I talk a lot about PTSD when someone's like, oh, I'm diagnosed PTSD. It's like, wonderful. Are you working with someone regularly on that?
Yeah.
Because as a breath worker or someone who's working in this landscape, I'm not clinically able to work with someone in that way, right? I don't like to tell, we always are careful in the United States, I'm sure, but just in general, to be able to say this is a clinical diagnosis and this breath work, this cold exposure, this whatever healing practice I'm using may not be addressing that to the depth that it needs to be.
Yeah. This may bring things up, right? And that's another thing I will sometimes say, this, if you have a history of trauma, if you are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, this may stimulate some of those memories. It may stimulate some reactions. So go slow. Yeah. And are you aware of when a trigger comes up? And I may probe and ask them some questions to just gauge how aware they are of their own triggers. So people that know they have PTSD often know when their triggers are coming up. And do you know how you best need support when that happens? What are some things that you can do to help yourself when you start to feel triggered? And how can I support you in those moments? Right. So again, I'm asking questions and making it everything's okay. Right. Just the dialogue is open about it, and just know that this isn't a treatment for that. So we're not working on resolving trauma here today, but we are going to help your body learn how to build some resilience.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. That's a good expression. Very beautifully put.
Because contrast therapy is tremendously valuable for building the nervous system's capacity to move between activation and deactivation. And so state change or movements between like extremes are incredibly supportive for building autonomic capacity. Or
my mentor Martin McPhillamy calls it arousal flexibility.
There you go. Yeah.
Oh my God, I love that term.
Yeah,
everybody listens when you say arousal, so game on. And then, but arousal flexibility, just like we think of metabolic flexibility to be able to navigate that space. But you must have I'm sure you've had this happen where people show up and they're in their fineness, and maybe you have an intake form even, and then all of a sudden there's something that's not on the intake form that happens in the middle of a session, and you sort of have to start flying at 10,000 feet again and say, hey, let's slow it down, modulate, talk about that, lean into that. And that can be a challenge.
Yeah. And it can be scary if we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Like, oh, fuck.
Yeah.
Something's happening. What do I do? Oh no, I've just fucked up. Right?
Yeah.
Those thoughts can come up. There have been a number of clients over the years that I've worked with, and I've had a very extensive intake process, and they didn't share anything about the things that ended up coming up in session. And when that happened, I'm like, okay, great, this is here, and let's get you some extra support on this thing, because I'm not the best person for that.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's how we deliver it that matters, right? So I want to stay joined with my client. I don't want to have to be like separating myself, completely disconnected from them. I don't want to feel like I have to push them away, but I also don't want to be doing it for them, an enmeshment of sorts, like, or merging with them.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to stay joined, which means that I'm an ally. I'm with you. I'm on your team, and I'm also not the best person. And one of the analogies that I will often use is, look, you wouldn't go to a vet to get your tooth pulled.
Yeah.
You wouldn't go see a proctologist to have brain surgery. And you definitely wouldn't go to your mechanic for, a haircut. Right? People specialize in different things, and that specialty signifies that they have training and an extensive background in a particular thing. So when we're working together, this is my background and my expertise, and these are the things I can do. When this other thing comes up, it's like, oh, you need to get an oil change. Well, definitely go over there to that place. It's the same thing. When trauma shows up in our container, whether it be emotional or psychological, physiological, that's all the same, but depending on how the symptom's presenting, it's like, hey, I've got this specialist that I know, and I think they might be a really good fit to help you process this thing while we work.
Yeah, but also there are people who are coaches where these things come to rise, and I think what's your recommendation, because fear is going to come up, or we use the tenet that Ta and Cole use, which is like, all your shit is welcome here. Yeah. But if the thing I always want to stress is, if you're going to say that, then you better be okay with someone really just saying something or behaving in a way that is in line with that, right? You have to be open to the possibility that it could go any direction. And I'm sure, I'm not talking about it necessarily getting violent or going real sideways, but we need to be okay with most of what's going to come up. And I think that takes some time and practice and knowing where our boundaries and edges are. I definitely have had some people I've worked with, coaches that have taken on clients that have to then set a boundary and say, there's actually someone, sweetly and kindly, there's someone better for you to work with, where there's actually a disconnection after a couple sessions or something, because something happens, right? That they would feel more comfortable, or just perhaps because the coach is like, oh, in my background, this is someone who's talking to me about sexual assaults, and that's in my background, and I just don't feel comfortable. It's a person of the opposite sex, or it's something that is an unsafe scenario. And then recognizing the ways that we can, with kindness, move that forward, right? Whether it is, like you said, in some ways, having a joining and saying, okay, I'm here to support and I'm going to stay in the picture, or
I'm going to find you somebody that can help you with this thing, and maybe we come back to this later. Yeah, it's the, don't try to do everything for everybody. Yeah. Just fucking don't, because that is a recipe for disaster. And this, Ta and Cole, and Ta especially, but not to say anything less about Cole, but they can say, bring all your shit, because they can take it, but not everybody can. Yeah. And I've watched Ta support and take and hold with all sorts of stuff, and he has the capacity to meet it without being triggered, without taking it on as his. Even if the person's at him about something, he has that capacity. Most people don't. Yeah. And
20 years as an ER nurse, you've seen a lot of.
That's right.
Seen a lot of things. Had to be calm in a lot of storms, I imagine.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and I'm not telling people don't show up with this, but more just saying instead, when we show up with that much openness, people will bring their darkest stuff, and we need to be trained to support them through that if we're going to invite it. There's a saying that I hear people throwing around, which is, all of you is welcome here. Live it, but don't say it. If you say, this is a safe space for you, all of you is welcome here, a person with a history of complex trauma hears, I can't trust you because that's what the perpetrator told me. So we don't
Really salient point to make for sure.
So we, instead of saying this is a safe space here, what we do is we invite safety through how we show up with permissive language, with tolerance for behavior or personality structure. And then the person feels that all of you really is welcome here. When people are around me, they often give me that feedback like, God, man, I just feel like I could be myself. I feel so safe around you. Like, thanks, I'm not trying to do that. It is a happy byproduct of who I've become, but it's not something I'm thinking, like, got to make this person feel safe.
Right. You're not like anxiously attached to that.
No, I'm not.
Are you okay? Are you okay? Can I get you anything? Are you okay?
Right.
How you doing?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead, I'm just present. I'm present with you. I'm interested in you. I want to understand you. And if something comes up, I know in me, I can be with you in it. And that comes from years of experience. And so, you know, if you're listening and you're at the beginning of your journey, know that you just got to put in some reps and practice and say yes to what you can handle.
Yeah. And then if you're getting some experience and putting your reps in, there's a beautiful course that Will runs called Trauma and Somatics. Could you, just as we start to wrap, could you just unpack a little bit about what you're teaching, the methodology, if you call it a methodology?
Yeah, it's our way of doing trauma-informed approach and somatics. Really, trauma and somatics, you'll come out the other side. You'll be trauma-informed. You can call yourself a trauma-informed somatic practitioner. But this is like an entry portal into waking up in many ways. It's a journey of personal transformation while you get lots of lovely science and lots of practices that you can do to support people when they're dysregulated, to recognize, like we teach you how to learn to track body language and all sorts of things like that. But beyond that, it's this arc of personal transformation where you're coming closer to yourself, where you're feeling, you're moving through the world and learning how to live a somatic reality, which is this being, instead of being fragmented, coming back to wholeness. And, you know, somatics, we believe, is about, like the word soma means our living wholeness. So it's all the parts. It's an integration of all of them. And so we teach that. That's just embedded in the foundation and the structure of everything. And you'll know when to refer out. You'll know how to spot the signs and symptoms of trauma. You'll learn about the categories of trauma. We teach a couple of different models for working with people, but you know, mostly people are changed.
Yeah, it like starts with you.
Yep.
Yeah.
We teach it
So
through
great.
our own experience. So everybody has an experience. So it's moduled content, the practical details. We have 6 modules that are self-study modules. They're audio files, and we have visuals in a workbook. It's not a workbook, but we call it a workbook. It's like slides. And then we have experiential classes. And the classes are entirely experiential. We don't do a lot of lecture. It's activities, exercises, breakout rooms, demos, practices, and things. It's all virtual right now. We'll eventually do it an in-person something in the future, but not yet. It's 10 classes over 12 weeks. And those 2 weeks off, we really teach about that being in the pause. And then one of the classes is what we call a consultation. So every student has an opportunity, if they want, to bring a case, like something that is going on with a client, and we dissect it. The facilitators support them and share how we might use a trauma-informed approach, or we might use somatic techniques, and give them instructions or guidance or encouragement or direction around how to work with the particular person. And we have all sorts of different kinds of practitioners in the group, so it's really fun because there might be a body worker asking questions, or a therapist asking questions, or a breathwork facilitator asking questions, and how we answer is going to be different depending on the person that's asking.
Yeah, so cool. So cool. Well, thanks for sharing your gifts, not just with me and everyone listening, but with the world. Because it is, there's a resonance about you, or everybody, I think, feels very held. So the depth of work and practice you've been giving us all since you were reading Jung at 17. I feel like I'm already behind the 8 ball.
Nah, don't do that to yourself.
I know.
You've got such a rich life of experience that has baked into it lessons and learning that I'll never have. And the beauty of life is each of us is an individual, and we're armed with the uniqueness that is us. And that's more than enough. I'll say one more thing, because the company that I run has been growing. While we start with trauma and somatics, we now have an additional training called attachment and somatics. And so where trauma and somatics is, here are the tools to become trauma informed. Here's some basic exercises you can do with clients. Here's how to support regulation when things get to be too much. Attachment and somatics is a deep dive on the somatic components of attachment dynamics. And then it's full of experiential work. And so we're really getting into the process work in that training. And it's exciting. My mother and I are leading this together.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
That's so great.
So we blend in, this isn't your traditional attachment theory course where we're teaching just traditional attachment theory. You learn about the history of attachment theory, but we're teaching a whole system that is more obscure, I'd say, although it's getting more popularized now, but where we're talking about early motor reflexes and how that can be used as an entry point to stimulate relational change and physiological change. And so the two programs, you can take one without taking the other, but it's great to have an understanding of the nervous system before you get into the attachment somatics training, because we do broad strokes overview, but we're really in the working with a body and working on relational dynamics. Whereas with trauma and somatics, it's not working on resolving things. It's working intent, like beside the person while the thing is there.
Yeah. It's great. What a great stack.
Yeah. We're expanding.
So
And
exciting.
I'm excited about that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, we've had a couple of people go through the program, and I could not be more excited to be sharing this time with you. Thank you so much for your service, and more to come.
Thank you.